The main message is that at this point where we are in Africa, especially if we use the African context, it's that resources are not finite. You know, and what I mean, resources are finite. Eventually they'll finish. So I think we should have a sense of urgency in managing resources on this continent. The continent is well endowed, we know that. Resources are all over the place, but demographic changes around the world make these resources very competitive. So Africa needs to go back to the fundamentals of governance, because in order for you to be successful with your resources, you need to know how to extract them, you need to know how to add value to them, you need to know how to use them and manage them for your own country first. And considering the youth bulge that we have in this continent, the future is more important. So African countries, African leadership need to start thinking to invest seriously, not only for today, but for tomorrow. What is new is the sense of urgency, right? So Africa, for the most part, A, has big countries, they're not small countries, so managing them is already a problem. B, the huge bulge is pretty new in the sense that most African countries are no more than 60 years. But at the same time, half the population, or more than half of this population, are under the age of 16. When you consider their future, then you take it in comparison with the future of the young Chinese or the young Indians. The struggle is pretty intense. Africa can only manage to give the skill set that they can afford to their own citizens. If Africa is squandering its own resources, it cannot compete on the trading arena in any adequate way to gain from the resources. Then they won't have the money to invest in the education, they won't have the money to invest in the health, they won't have the money to build the leadership for the next generation that will compete with the counterparts in China, in the US, in India. So it's a serious disadvantage. We hear a lot now people talk about the frontier market, the emerging market. Terms like that worry me, because they're not talking about us, they're talking about their future. If it's a frontier, then it's not our frontier. We live here already. Whose frontier it is and why? That should be very worrisome to us. It should not be the end of the world. Those are contingencies that emerge. Leadership should be rising to the occasion to address those issues. So it's a fair trade, it's give and take. At this point, Africa is at a disadvantage, and I think natural resources are becoming more of a curse, when in fact resources should not be a curse, they should be a blessing. Africa is dealing a lot with what I call the curse of institutions. Correct. Because bad institutions cause the conflict that Africa is dealing with in mismanagement of these resources. I'll say DRC is a fragile state, but DRC is not the only fragile state. I think when these terms like fragile state become problematic, I will argue that the majority of African countries are fragile states, because fragile state is not so much about conflict. Fragile state is about the resiliency of your institutions. How strong are you to withstand shocks, whether the economic shocks, whether emergency in terms of epidemics, whether the armed conflict? Do you have strong enough institutions to withstand those shocks? And the answer is no for the majority of African countries. So in that sense, we have a spectrum of fragility. And that spectrum of fragility is primarily fueled by weak institutions across the continent. That's where the curse lies for us, not in the resources.